Hey there, fellow creators. Ben here from Cinder Studios, and this week we're talking about handmade versus handcrafted, at least when it comes to art supplies. Because in every other industry, they're basically the same thing. Stick around. So if you were to crack open a dictionary, type into Google, or go on Wikipedia, you'd probably find that the terms handmade and handcrafted are used absolutely interchangeably, and there's basically no difference between either of them. But when it comes to producing art supplies and buying them and consuming things like an artist, you'll find that handmade and handcrafted actually mean two different things. So when it comes to producing art supplies, there's essentially three different methods, or three different main categorizations of how products are made. The first is sort of mass-produced factory-made stuff. So something that comes to mind off of that is pencils. Pencils are probably really hard to do in sort of the handmade or crafted thing anyway, unless you're really doing some interesting things with maybe like a stick or something. Basically, how pencils are made are you have essentially two pieces of wood, little half circles, so to speak. They cut a groove in the middle, they stick the lead in, and they sandwich together and glue them together, and then you have a pencil. With the exception of maybe something like a woodless pencil, which obviously you wouldn't have to do that with. Then there comes the handmade and handcrafted categories. Well, let's talk about handmade first. So something like Williamsburg oils says right on the tube, handmade oils. But if you watch any of their videos, you see them using machinery, and you're like, well, wait a minute, that's machine made. That's not handmade. Well, handmade doesn't mean you did absolutely everything by hand. That's what handcrafted means. Handmade refers to there's people involved in this process besides just like starting the machine and getting it running, or just dumping the pigment into a vat, and then when it goes through the assembly line, then a tube of paint is shot out at the end. Handmade refers to the fact that there are people involved in the process. So they're putting the pigment into a mixer. They're adding the certain proportions of pigment and stabilizer and binder and whatever happens to go into the paint into that thing by hand, starting the machines by hand, stopping them by hand, watching things progress. There's people involved in every step of the process. They're ladling paint onto the dispersion mill. They're watching it go through. They're seeing that consistency, seeing the viscosity as it comes out to make sure that that's right. So essentially there's people involved in the process, but machines are still allowed to be used. The advantages to a hand-made product is that there's more quality control. You're able to go through just certainly some room for human error, but not as much. You know, you're able to monitor the process more. And I think of I feel like a lot of art supplies are considered handmade. They're just not marketed and advertised as such. Okay, now that said, what exactly do we mean by handcrafted? Okay, so I've kind of already alluded to this a little bit more, but when it comes to handcrafted, you're talking little to no machinery. I mean, you can use some stuff. I mean, something like, I think the Blue Ridge oils comes to mind. I don't know if it's technically considered handcrafted. I know he uses a small dispersion mill when he's making his paint, but that's more a necessity rather than a preference. But you're looking at probably a lot fewer people involved in the process of making the product, and you're looking at everything is a lot slower a process. What comes to mind when I think about something that's handcrafted would be certain chalk pastels. Now I use Rembrandts, and Rembrandts are pretty sure are extruded into a mold. Now this is totally fine. I love Rembrandts, but because that's the brand I use, I don't actually have any of the hand-rolled stuff floating around. And that's what you will find in a lot of descriptions of those products. They'll refer to the pastels as being hand-rolled. Now, I've seen only a couple of videos out there that really kind of show that hand-rolling process. Basically, you're making essentially pigment clay by mixing just enough water into a batch of pigment to make it essentially like clay. They'll roll it out on a table, or I've seen people use like paper towels if they're doing like really individual small batch stuff. And at that point, then or you make a bigger batch and extrude it out into a long tube and slice it up, and then roll it out to even it out, and paper and this and that and whatever. So that's sort of the more the thoughts of something like that's handcrafted. It's like one or two people maybe, or even a very small team that's a lot more specialized, that is able to produce a product that doesn't rely on the heavy machinery to do the legwork. Now, if all of that sounds kind of confusing, it kind of is, to be honest. So think about it this way, as a much more simplified idea. If you were a dress designer and you have, let's say you have two options for making a dress. You can either use a sewing machine, or you can sit there and stitch it by hand, one by one, and have thimbles on all your fingers. So if you use the machine, because duh, why wouldn't you? It makes everything easier. That would be considered a handmade product. I mean, you still ran it through by hand, you still did all this design work, but you used a machine to help you in that process. That would be a handmade product. If you sat there with a needle and a thimble, and you're like, nope, no machines, I'm going to do everything by hand, I'm going to eyeball the stitch, that is a handcrafted product. So at this point, I'm sure you're wondering, why does this even matter? Well, in the grand scheme of things, buy what you want, use what works for you, of course, as always. But knowing how certain things are made and what these terms mean can help you make better and more reasonably informed decisions when you're buying your art supplies. You might look at a pastel and its individual stick is $7, and it's like, why? And you see the term handcrafted underneath it. And then you see the Rembrandt stick, which is like $2. And you're like, well, this is cheaper, I'm going to get this one. But when you understand why those two price differences are like that, it's like, well, one took a lot longer, and there are a lot fewer, if any, machines involved in that process. So it's like, okay, well, does that mean the quality is better because it's handmade, or is the quality of the factory better? Well, I would say it's not better one way or the other, but it is different. You're going to see some things that are notably different. Things that are more big box, art supply retailers. I mean, you can find handcrafted stuff there too. But the cheaper stuff, but still very high quality stuff, is going to be consistent, batch to batch to batch to batch, every single time. Things are formulated by chemists. They know what they're doing. They've been doing it for years. Something that is handcrafted by a small, say, paint maker or pastel maker might have some batching issues. You might see that, oh, this pastel is more crumbly. But this one, made by the same company, that's the same brand, is harder. It's got more of a thing. And then you might buy the same colors the next time around, and that's flip-flop. Now this one's softer, this one's harder. Or you might see like streaks in the pastel itself. I mean, those usually denote lower quality, but you have to understand that because it's usually just a small team or sometimes just one person making those products, you've got to allow yourself a wider margin for human error. And that's sort of the biggest difference between all of them. So I'm curious to hear from you guys on your thoughts on this. I know it's one of those things that probably doesn't make a ton of difference to know it, but when you do know the difference, you can make more informed decisions, and it's probably better for you as a creator in the long run to know those differences, so you know what you're buying and what you're using and why you're using it, and that's really important. So let me know your thoughts and comments below. Hit the like button if you learned something or enjoyed hearing me talk about this stuff. Get subscribed if you're not already. Check me out in social links in the description box below, including my own website where you can buy my artwork, the community Discord where I often chat with you guys on Sunday evenings. You can also ask me questions there outside of the YouTube public forum, and chat with other artists and get feedback on your work and all that fun stuff. I'm also on Instagram, Facebook, most other social media platforms. That's it for this one. Keep on creating. This has been Cinder Block Studios, and I will see you guys next time.